gamers, that every great journey must come to an end, and our time with FF15 is done. This will be the final video over on the TDP about FF15. Our next video concerning this game will be after a ton of research, so bear in mind what I'm about to talk about, my thoughts and things, and before I've really dug into the development nightmare this game had. This is purely my impressions of what the game gave me to think about. Alright, so I had one final day of cleanup and figuring things out. I had a real struggle with finding the keys. I didn't know what they were for, and I tried everything. I really did. I knew that it somehow involved a Royal Arms, probably, because I was missing a Royal Arms. And I spent a ton of time just browsing the map, looking for quests and things like that. I noticed some weird things, and I kind of got some hints as to some things. I landed on the big thing most people want to hear about, and I've probably been looking forward to, that I didn't know about, was that I noticed a strange yellow line off in the mountains, and people were like, you should check that yellow line. So I rode over there, I went and explored it. It was a mountainous thing, and I couldn't get in. So I was like, right, I'll get the car to see if I can see where you're supposed to get into this area. And there's a little runway on the other side. I was like, oh, this is an area you get after you get the flying car. Landed in there, and started to explore a little bit. Nothing mega going on. A couple of large Marlboro enemies that were teamed up, but they just died. Nothing special there. They had low HP. I'm certainly used to it at this point. In fact, I'm getting close to, like, reasonably hitting the level cap. So we've invested a lot of time in this game. We're like 70, level 70, and I believe the cap is 99. I then found a building, which was a dungeon. I was like, oh, the final Royal Arms is here. Now, that would make some sort of sense, right? No. What this turned out to be... what I say here might annoy some people, but give me a little rope on this, is this turns out to be something that a lot of players who've played Final Fantasy 15 absolutely detested in many, many ways. Now, obviously, I didn't know what I was getting into, so I didn't come into it with any preconceived notion, but it is a jumping puzzle dungeon, and it's very, very, very elaborate. It's full of traps. It's full of many routes and pathways. Some awkward little jumps that need to be done, especially because the game isn't built to be a platformer. And again, FF15 just wants it all. The game's not designed with that in mind, so certainly Noctis's little roll that he does if he drops more than 2 feet down is very frustrating. The most frustrating part of this, honestly, was if you turn Noctis, even if you turn the camera and rotate him, he walks like 2 or 3 steps, and that just walks off the edge regularly. And it did remind me, it's like, we solved this in like 1996, which is always what blows my mind about some modern games, is that the issue I'm having was solved 30 years ago. And they did that in like Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, is if Link approaches an edge, he will sort of teeter, and you have to really push to get him to jump off an edge. You have to fully put the stick down. Tapping the stick, he'll just sort of teeter around, and that allows for many tricks and things, and really precise positioning that you'll see in the speedruns. However, that's not here. Now, I'll say this. I didn't mind this dungeon at all. In fact, this was an ultra forgiving dungeon. The checkpoint system is really good. You barely get sent back. Often when we do jumping puzzles in any other games, it's like you mess up after being invested in the actual process of finding the route for like 15 minutes. It puts you all the way back at the beginning. You got to do it again. This one, not really. Like, the most lengthy checkpoint to returning to where we were was maybe like 50 seconds if you played reasonably well, and you kind of like, oh, I know where to go now. Like, the length was like, which way do we go? But ultimately, it was very fair, and everything kind of made sense. I very rarely was in a position of, I don't know where to go. It kind of all fit together. The only bit that started to get me was when they start messing with perspective by rotating all the rooms into different directions, so you're kind of walking on angular slopes. Sometimes Noctis can walk on them, sometimes he can't. And you're like, okay, I think we go this way, and it also feels like I'm kind of upside down, or I'm walking sideways. It reminded me of David Bowie in Labyrinth, with the weird tessellation. But it was fine. It was actually really fine. The issue came up, it's just too long. And your average, it's kind of fine for me as a streamer who can give 8 hours. Oh, we bumped into this thing that takes like 4 hours to do. That's fine. We've got a whole streaming day to do it. But for your average player who's a lover of Final Fantasy, which has been a decades-old franchise, has got a job, wife, kids, partners, whatever, it's got a whole life going on. It's like, I can't just sit down and dedicate like 4 or 5 hours to doing a dungeon in Final Fantasy and then returning to the start at some point. It's just, it's not reasonable anymore to give that kind of time in my life over to this game. I've got to, like, book a weekend to do this. You know what I mean? I don't get home till 7, 8 p.m. and I've got to get up again tomorrow. And I've got things to do. I've got to make dinner. I've got to do all that kind of stuff. So from that perspective, I totally get it. It could have been a third less duration, I think would have been really fair. And people would have been, like, okay with it. It wasn't actually the jumping or the puzzling that was the problem. It was the sheer length of the damn thing. It was fun, though. I enjoyed this. It wasn't super annoying. It gave you tons and tons of loot, which was really nice, but it did not give me the final Royal Arms. So I will admit, I cracked. The way I did this was I asked several questions to the chat, purely because I didn't want to spend my entire day chasing down wild geese. So I was like, is it somewhere on the map that I've just not located? No, right? Because the guys knew where I was supposed to go. Ultimately, it did end up being the dungeon that I had been in before. And the reason I left is I actually revisited that dungeon on this day, is it started repeating. It started looping around to the places I'd already been to before. And I was like, and they had ticks over them to say, you've done this area. I was like, it's just looping now, and there's a thing down the bottom that needs a key. So the logic in me was like, oh, well, I've reached where I'm supposed to go, but you need a key to progress further, which is not the case. In fact, it's a multi-route thing where you circle round and you can, from what I can tell, in only one of the 4 or 3 avenues that you go down in the final room, only one of them has alternative paths in. And you have to notice that there's an alternative path, which you might not, which I did not. And if you do that, then you get to reach the actual finale of this dungeon, excluding the key element. Where you fight a Jabberwock, I think, which was very simple for us to kill, and got the final Royal Arms. And then, nothing happened. Nothing happened. And I was like, right, no phone call, no notification, nothing. So I was like, all right, we're done. And I still don't know where these goddamn keys are. So I was browsing the map until buried, and this was so weird, buried underneath a giant outpost icon, there's a very slim yellow question mark glow. It's completely obscured besides some little edgings where a quest had appeared. I was like, okay, let's go up there. It was in the mercenary camp, where the old lady that I'd spoken to ages ago and thought looked kind of sus, is kind of sus. She just gives you the key. And I was like, Jesus Christ, I've been chasing this thing for like 3 days. Gives you the key, which then gives you 8 quests to visit areas. And destroy the menace within. I was like, oh, this is going to be the super bosses. This is where we're going to find like Omega and Hermes and all these things that we find at the end of massive dungeons like we did in FF12, where there's the enormous maze dungeon and it leads to all these interesting characters, Ultima, things like that. So I was like, oh, it's probably this. So I decided to try one. I went back to the tower that I just cleared because I knew it was empty of enemies and I could get straight to the bottom. Did that, and it didn't turn out to be that. These are very apparently just mastery challenges, is what I would call them. It was very apparent. It was like, okay, you can't use any healing items anymore, and now you really need to know what the enemies do and not take damage and things like that. So I found the bestiary, which was like, these are weak to fire, these are weak to lightning, and you can use the ring in there, which was interesting, to defeat them, but they get very high level very quickly. And ultimately, I wasn't enjoying this. And I was like, okay, is this what this is? It's just like post-game mastery challenges. And they were like, yeah. So I gave it like 2 goes, got through a few floors, and then I was like, nah, not for me. And left it alone. I was like, I'm not doing this. This is just not fun. And they were like, good, because it's like 100 floors. I did like 6. I was done with it. I was like, yeah, this is like 100 floors. So I was like, okay, we're done. That's the end. There's a ton more stuff to do that's just like side quest cleanup and a few extra. There's a couple of quote-unquote super bosses, but it turns out I've actually killed most of them just regularly. So it's not a big deal. So that'll be the end of FF15. Fair enough. Not a bad day. Really enjoyed the jumping puzzle. I would say that. I really enjoyed it. I had fun in there. It was a nice mystery in solving it, and I had the time to do it, so it wasn't a big deal. Very, very little frustration overall with that dungeon. Final little thoughts here. Again, before I've dug into it. Final Fantasy 15 is a story of a game that wanted everything. It's almost the epitome of what we call scope creep. And scope creep is like, what will your game have in it? And you've got to set limits. And you could argue that Star Citizen is kind of the poster child of this in more modern times, although it's dubious with what's going on there with all that money. But either way, it's just a case of it needs this, this, and this. It needs Final Fantasy 15's like description at the start was probably a Final Fantasy 15 for everyone, which is like for beginners and old gamers alike. Something like that. It's on the splash screen when you actually boot the game every time. It's like a Final Fantasy for everybody. And that's because they tried to put everything in here, and it's just not possible. Like, a game needs limits. And every time I'm fortunate enough to have spoken to so many head developers of massive billion-dollar gaming franchises, certainly over the last 7 years. And each of them will tell you, is like, you just can't have everything. Like, yeah, it would be nice. We're not stupid. We're game developers. And there's a really interesting conversation I had with Ian Hazakostas, who's the game director of World of Warcraft. And I was talking to him about how it feels awkward in that game, is that there's huge story beats happening with invasions from the ocean, swords crushing into the planet, and yet nothing seems to happen. Like, in any sort of logical sense, we talk about the sword, which most people know about even if they don't play WoW, is a planetary-sized sword is currently buried into the planet, and it has been now for a few years, and there's nothing there. There's no town set up. There's no people visiting it. There's no people trying to harvest its resources of this extraterrestrial godlike weapon that's clearly like I would like its metals, right? You can imagine the goblins and the money grabbers trying to make armor out of it, weapons out of it. And it always reminds me of the first Thor movie in the Marvel universe that a lot of people have seen, is when Mjolnir lands in New Mexico. In less than 24 hours, there's hundreds of people there. They've set up camps. They're trying to use their trucks to drag Mjolnir off where it's laying. All this stuff is happening because this hammer has been found, and people would react that way. Let's go and see this strange thing, this immovable hammer. And now we've got a planetary-sized sword digging in it. And I was asking him, I was like, why isn't there stuff happening there? There should be something happening there. It's odd that it's not. In fact, it feels really immersion-breaking for this living, breathing world, which an MMO should be, and nothing's happening there. And he just said, because ultimately we can't have everything. Yes, it would be nice. We're not dumb. Yes, of course it would be nice. But I have to make the decision as the game director is, do I invest the next X million dollars and hundreds of people's time and effort, from 3D artists to world designers to all those kinds of people, to making something people will visit every now and again and may have some quest and story, or do we build the new raid, which we know 90% of our player base is going to take part in and enjoy? And it's just, there's a finite amount of resources you can pour into it, even at the $1 billion level. So it's like, I get it, but FF15 didn't seem to get that memo. It wants an epic cinematic story that clearly inspired by a lot of movies. Like, it's very, very clear as you play through this, and I've made references from Transformers onwards. It wants this gigantic cinematic feel. It wants to be Metal Gear Rising Revengeance in its combat system. It wants that, and it wants to mix those in with the QTEs. Like, it's almost one for one in certain encounters, that its inspiration comes from that level of ARPG, but it also wants to be a full-on Final Fantasy game. It wants to have all those whimsical elements. It wants a cooking system. It wants a crafting system. It wants an in-depth fishing system. It wants to have chocobo system that you can invest and level in the chocobos. It wants chocobo races. It also wants a car. It wants multitudes of cars. It wants flying cars. It wants car racetracks. It wants all these things. It wants open world exploration, but also mixing in with linear story. It wants to be a full-on action game, but it needs to have the same consumables and things that it has in the rest of the Final Fantasy world, so it's all recognizable. It wants you to have a full-on hunt system, because some of the other games like FF12 had an invested and well-received hunt system, so it's got to have a full-on hunt system. It wants super bosses. It wants dramatic encounters. It wants to feel epic. It wants everything, and I just feel like at the start when they were planning this out, they were like, we want to take everything that people love about Final Fantasy from 1 all the way through 14, and we want to put it into one game and create the ultimate Final Fantasy game. And you just see where the devs just were like, dude, we can't just keep adding more to this game. And everything starts to get watered down, certainly by the latter half. Like, the arena is a really cool idea, but ultimately it's very obvious, and it's just not that interesting after a while, because you know exactly which one's going to win. You're asking people to gamble on a system where the winner is kind of predetermined after you've learned for about 30 minutes who does what. You can't lose. Like, it's very, very rare that you lose. Therefore, the idea of gambling and getting massive odds and payouts is just not there. It's dead. Like, the odds it tells you in the game are usually correct. Right, if you get a good condition curl in there, it dominates absolutely everything else that's in the encounter. And your contribution via the Vuvuzelas to inspire them in some way is kind of pointless. If you just damage buff a curl, it'll eradicate half the room. Or if it's not there but you got a Gigantitoad, it just can't die. It's got too much HP. And you can heal it, so it's a waste of time. All these elements, it really, really wants to be everything. Everything it can possibly do. And in a lot of ways, it does some of them so, so well. It really does. And I talked about, like, it's cliche, but it's true. The highs are really high. When it nails it spectacularly. And I had an absolute, overwhelmingly great time in the open world area. I did. It was nice. There was lots to explore. There was so much stuff off the beaten track. Even in the last couple of days while trying to find the Royal Arms, I found several dungeons that just were there. They didn't have some big ending. They were just there to get some loot. There was a couple of mini bosses in there. They're just there to enjoy. You found a dungeon because you explored. Cool, enjoy it. It doesn't mean it's part of some overall massive arc. It's just extra dungeons we put into the game. All this kind of stuff plays out really well. Horror. It does horror really well. Like, when it gets it right, it's as atmospheric as a horror game. It does it really well. When it wants to try and make you feel unusual and creeped out, it does that. And the funny side of it is really good. The relationship between the four guys is really extraordinarily done well. I came in with this boy band vibe that I'd heard about, and you see from the marketing is they look like a boy band. They do, all clad in leather running across the desert. But then when you play it, it's like, it's not like that whatsoever. Like, they're genuine friends. There's some good backstory there. And then the lows are just so low. So bizarrely in the floor. The railroading of the story midway through the game is just obnoxious and unnecessary. And I'm playing the game that has been fixed. The Royal Edition has so many modifications that have improved it over the initial game that I can't imagine how angry and frustrated I would be with my Final Fantasy game just being completely lacking context. The story is all over the place, and I know there are story defenders who are like, you should read the novel that came out. I've done a little research on that. This novel came out because they were cancelling the DLC, and the story still isn't done. It's all over the place, and they're trying to fix it and stitch it back together. So they make a novel because they're not going to bother making any more DLC for this game. We know that, like, Arenea's DLC was cancelled. Luna Freya's DLC was cancelled because it just wasn't working out. And you can see that with the amount of people who didn't do Ignis's, or at least according to the Steam stats, despite the fact it's the best piece of content Final Fantasy 15 offers. And nobody bothered. Just not doing it. And so you have all these problems where the game is just like, we're done with it. The director's walking away. Like, I'm tired of this game. Like, it's... People aren't happy, people don't like it, and I'm now pouring years of my life into trying to remedy this situation because we couldn't make the game in the first place because there was just too much goddamn stuff, right? And you see that reflected so obviously in the Adamantoise fight. It's clearly done for marketing reasons. It's done so they could put something out there. It's like, there's a boss that takes 3 days to kill, and look how epic it is. And then you play it and you're like, this is awful. It's just terrible. It's not fun. The people who made it clearly didn't care because it doesn't really have any mechanics. It just kind of shuffles its feet in its head. And that's it, because it's too big. It can't roam around the countryside, right? It can't be done. In fact, they have to load the game separately in order to fight this damn thing. It, like, blacks out and then comes back to say, oh, now the Adamantoise is there. Where if you then cancel the hunt, it's just a mountain again. And you're like, okay, this is so weird and so immersion breaking, right? I want to look more into it, but this was for me, Final Fantasy 15 was an attempt to build, and I think a noble and earnest attempt to build the ultimate Final Fantasy game for the modern era that encompassed everything that people loved about this genre. And in trying to do that, they just set themselves up for failure. It's built on a foundation of jelly. It's gonna fall down. Like, there's some things that are stable and they kind of hold on, but everything else around the wayside just kind of drifts away, and just I don't think a dev team of thousands could have put everything into this game that they wanted to and have it done properly. The fact that it kind of is coherent at all, given how much they tried to put into this game, is kind of insane. Because it's not working, and some people are like, oh, but they did it in like 7 and 6. They put loads of stuff into that. One, yes, they did, but they're also working with a much simpler overall palette of game, right? The mini games and stuff in 7 look, man, like the battles, the stupid tower defense game. Let's not pretend this is amazing gaming. I can't remember what it's called, like Eagle Canyon or whatever it's called. The similar with like the snowboarding and stuff like that. At the time, yes, it's phenomenally well done. At the time, it is. But let's not pretend it was a difficult thing to create within that game. Just like the arena in 15, it's not a super difficult thing to create. But by modern standards, and not back in 1997 or wherever when Final Fantasy VII came out, it's just not the same. And it isn't, and you can't pretend it is, right? We can't just say, well, and 6 is done in the pixel art style on a SNES. You know, it's just not the same. Adding extra text boxes and things like that is already kind of what the game is built on. And I imagine it's similar to Chrono Trigger. Like, one of the hardest things to do is the car race, which is why it's very set in stone like a cutscene, and you can kind of just move forwards and backwards, but ultimately that's kind of it. It's not the same. It's not the same as trying to pull it into a AAA modern era game that Final Fantasy 15 is. So I've brought this up several times with other videos. I feel kind of bad for a lot of the devs, because you can see where they just not just didn't have time, but clearly didn't want to make it. Like, this is just not a good idea. And I feel bad for the writers, because I have not double-checked this, but I'm 90% sure that they had to draft in writers later to try and remedy this situation. Like, Arden is such a wasted opportunity, because Arden had the potential to be extraordinarily good and have a really satisfying, good ending to the game, and it doesn't happen that way. And then you find out later on that they just kind of lock it into fate has determined this. You're destined to do this. And also the confirmation I have seen is that the devs are like, yeah, the canon ending is that it's predetermined and it has to be this way. Is lazy. It's redundant. It's pointless. It's dissatisfying, because it's like, okay, so nothing we do here matters. And then their bizarre decision to start messing with alternative timelines, as if to try and satisfy everybody. Which comes back to wanting it all and having everything. It's like, we'll have the canon story, but some players won't like that, so let's have alternative timelines where things happen differently. So that we're like satisfying those guys, and people can go, well, that's my canon ending. And that's my canon ending. And all this kind of stuff is like, you can't just try and please everybody. Like, you have to stick to your guns and go with what you can do, which 16 does. And it has flaws. Right? 16 is limited by its resources. And again, I've tried to look into the budgets for these games, but I have to believe that the budget for 16 was way, way less than 15. Because there's clearly a lot of areas that were like, we can't do anything with this in 16, so we're just not going to. I mean, 16 has one of the worst crafting systems I've ever seen. It's entirely pointless. A very, very, very basic hunt system. A ludicrously linear world map to go around. But they have the most elaborate, over-the-top, and intriguing video game story that I saw of the year. Like, that was fully invested in characters that I will remember for many, many years going forward, right? Like, even side characters like Dion, Bahamut are amazing. They're so good. And this is wonderful. This side of the game, not so good. But they, within the scope of what they were trying to achieve, they stuck to their goals. Final Fantasy 16 is like, we're story first, other things kind of later on. So that's my initial thoughts now before research. I mean, I'm walking away with a memory, so I'll leave it there. We're on to a new adventure, so tune in tomorrow to see exactly what that is. See you again, guys. Bye-bye.